Let's go ahead and take a look at the supply of labor, which is the number of hours an individual is willing to work at various wage rates. And if you work at a job, you actually find yourselves in the supply side within this particular market. You're the ones that are providing or supplying your labor. You are working, so therefore you are on the supply side in this market. So it's a little bit more of an unusual market because we rarely find ourselves as individuals on the supply side, but this is a special case where we find ourselves on this particular point in the market. And the big question that we want to talk about within the individual supply curve for the labor market is how many hours is a person willing to work at every single wage rate? So exactly how much are you willing to work? How many hours are you willing to work at every single wage rate that we can sort of think about? And that's a big question that we want to ask as we build up the individual supply curve. So here, individual supply curve, individual supply curve. And this individual supply curve is just going to be inherent for you yourselves. It's going to be different for every single person. And like we said before, the question that we want to ask is what determines how many hours? What determines how many hours? How many hours a person is willing to work? Person is willing to work at every single wage rate. So at every wage rate. At every wage rate. So in general, in order to answer this question, we as economists have to divide up your time into two different components. So what do you think there are two things, what are the two things that you can do with your free time, do you think? In this case, our limiting constraint is of course going to be time. So limiting constraint for you and I is time. We only have 24 hours in a day. Sometimes we wish there was more. So 24 hours in a day. So do we spend our entire day working? Do we spend half of our day working? If not, what else can we do? So we can divide our sort of time into two different components. We can either work or have some type of leisure. So work and leisure. Work and leisure. And basically by dividing our activities into these two categories, work and leisure, it can sort of tell us exactly how much we're going to be working at every single wage rate as we build up the individual supply curve. And in order for any of us to start working, we need to have a minimum amount of money in order for us to have some type of work component. And that's going to be something called the reservation wage. And the reservation wage is the lowest wage at which an individual is willing to work. And like we said, for the individual supply curve, it's going to be different for everybody. So some of us will not be willing to work unless our wage rate is, say, maybe $10 an hour. Some of us have a few standards, so maybe we're not willing to work unless we get $15 an hour, maybe $20 an hour based on our qualifications and experiences. But the reservation wage is essentially telling us the lowest wage rate that we'd be willing to accept in order to begin working. So let's go ahead and say we start off at Florida's minimum wage, which is $8.46. So not a very large amount, $8.46. It's hard to imagine people living on this amount. The minimum wage does not have to be one's reservation wage, but it provides us with a very good starting point to showcase exactly how many hours you're going to be willing to work at every single wage rate. So suppose that we start off at the $8.46 and say, hey, with this minimum wage, you're probably going to work some type of positive amount of hours. Say maybe you're going to work maybe 10 hours in a particular day. However, suppose that we increase your wage rate from $8.46 to say maybe $15 an hour. If this is going to be the case, do you think you're going to be working more hours or fewer hours? Suppose that we increase your wage rate to maybe $25 an hour. In most instances, the vast majority of us will probably say, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and work a lot more because my wage rate has increased from this minimum wage of $8.46 all the way to $25. So I want to maximize my earning power, maximize how much money I can get. So therefore, I'm going to go ahead and want to work more. And when this happens, when we want to go ahead and work more when our wage rate increases, that's going to go ahead and be our first effect that we take a look at under the individual labor supply, which is known as the substitution effect. So the substitution effect and the income effect are basically telling us exactly how many hours we're going to be working when we change the wage rate, and it's going to showcase exactly what the labor for the individual supply curve is going to look like. So as the illustration, as the example that we sort of just brought up, this is going to be detailing the substitution effect, which tells us that as we increase our wage rate, we're going to go ahead and work more. And this is the most typical effect that you and I feel most often. So here, the substitution effect. Substitution effect. And the substitution effect is exactly that. Higher wages mean that the value of work has increased and the opportunity cost of leisure is higher. So higher wages mean that the value of work has increased, that the value of work has increased, and the opportunity cost of leisure is higher. And the opportunity cost of leisure is higher. So here, essentially, by not working at the higher wage rate, you're essentially giving up a lot of potential gains. So the substitution effect, once again, higher wages mean that the value of work has increased and the opportunity cost of leisure is higher. So when we go from this $8.46 all the way to $25 per hour, that just tells you that you probably want to go ahead and work more. The value of your work has increased. We do note that the substitution effect is always positive. And if we just want to go ahead, if we just want to go ahead and give like a sort of simple statement about the substitution effect, it just tells us that the higher the wage, the more work that we're going to go ahead and want to do. So higher wage, work more, and less leisure. So the first component or the first effect that we have under the individual supply curve is known as a substitution effect. However, there is going to be a contrasting effect, just as we saw on the slide, which is going to sort of go against about the substitution effect, which tells us that as we increase the wages, we're going to go ahead and work less. And that's something known as the income effect. So it might be a little bit unusual for us to think about that if we increase your wage rate, you're going to work less, but this is what the income effect is going to come into play. So income effect. So suppose that we take your $25 per hour for work, and we increase your wage rate even more. Suppose now that we give you, say, $100 per hour, or it's just something a ridiculous amount, so maybe $1,000 per hour. Do you think you're going to go ahead and work even more compared to when you had $25 per hour at your job? And the answer is probably not. You maybe want to go ahead and only maybe work maybe 1 hour a day or maybe 2 hours a day. And that's just going ahead and hitting on the idea of this income effect, where higher wages mean that you can maintain the same standard of living by working fewer hours. Before, you maybe want to take the full impact or the full sort of effect of the $25 per hour, but here, because you get $100 per hour now or $1,000 per hour, you don't need to work as much in order to get the same amount of money. And that's exactly what the income effect is sort of purporting here. So higher wages mean that you can maintain the same standard of living, mean that you can maintain the same standard of living by working fewer hours. And with the income effect, once again, because this is the individual labor supply curve, it does differ from person to person. So some of us may be willing to work a lot less, only if we have a very, very high amount, but some of us will be willing to work less at lower amounts, say maybe $30 an hour, $50 an hour. There is some type of academic research that says that the income effect, on average, for most of individuals, on average, typically is right around $75 to $80 per hour. So still a relatively high amount. With the income effect, we do note that it's going to be generally negative. So generally, not always negative. So generally negative. And as before, just for completion, if we just wanted a simple statement, if we have a higher wage, so higher wage, it tells us that we just have the opposite case here. We work less, and we have more leisure. So these two effects, the substitution effect and the income effect, are the contrasting effects that will tell us exactly what the individual labor supply curve is going to look like. Here, once again, substitution effect, income effect, we basically detailed all of this. So what do you think our individual supply curve is going to look like when we combine both of these effects together? Our individual labor supply curve is going to be a backward bending supply curve. So formally, it's known as the backward bending individual labor supply. It's essentially going to be a parabola in this case. We have the wage rate on the vertical axis, and we have the hours of work on the horizontal axis. So what does this tell us? It tells us that as we increase the wage rate from, say, $0 to a wage rate of, say, maybe $10 per hour, what happens to our number of hours of work? We notice that we increase our hours of work from 0 all the way to L1 in this instance. So here, this is exactly where the substitution effect is dominating. We increase your wage rate, you want to go ahead and work more. And this is going to be the more prominent effect all the way to the sort of peak of this parabola, all the way up to wage rate W2 in this instance. So as we increase the wage rate all the way to W2, we notice that the hours of work are also increasing. So anywhere at the bottom half of this parabola, this is where the substitution effect is going to dominate the income effect. At exactly the peak right here, this is where the substitution effect is exactly equal to the income effect. So we're sort of indifferent between working more or working less at the peak of this parabola. But what happens if we increase your wage rate even more beyond W2? Suppose we increase it all the way to W3. So we go from this $25 per hour all the way to this $100 per hour. What happens to your hours of work now? We notice that your hours of work start declining. They go from L2 all the way back to L1 in this instance. And anywhere on the top half of this parabola where we see the hours of work declining when the wage rate increases, this is exactly where the income effect dominates the substitution effect. So here, on the top half of the parabola, income effect dominates the substitution effect, but the bottom half of the parabola, that's just the opposite, where the substitution effect dominates the income effect. So here, the individual labor supply curve is not our typical upward sloping line, but is a backward bending parabola as we see in this instance. And this is exactly where the substitution effect and the income effect that we brought up is going to come into play. And once again, the point at where the parabola is going to break does differ from person to person. So for some individuals, it might break a little bit earlier. For others, it might break a little bit further. But in general, we do note that for most individuals, we have a backward bending shape for the labor supply curve. How does this going to come into play when we take a look at the market labor supply curve? We'll see that in the next video.